expected this last phase of Sauber to be janky here or there. Not like this. Not like this. It's completely nuts. Wheelie nuts. I get it. Sauber have been going through some major changes with the way they design their cars. James Key is starting to implement the designs and ideas that McLaren chose to say goodbye to, and of course there is a lot of things going on in the background as Audi soon take over the entire team and the Sauber name disappears from Formula 1 seemingly forever. Yet the anonymity of the recent years of Alfa Romeo has stuck with them despite the name change back to their original brand, and has been punctuated with many pit stop errors. It's just yet another one of this year's traditions. Normally pit stop errors don't get that much coverage, and by the time we're on the other side of a weekend, it's usually forgotten. Unless your name is Valtteri Bottas, of course, and pit stop errors and your name sort of become synonymous with that one weekend in Monaco 2021, that entire section of car had to be shipped home, practically fused together, and they had to basically bodge it out so that means they could separate all the different components. It got that bad. Yes, the Sauber issues aren't nearly as drastic as that, but they are just as costly when it comes to time stuck in the pits. Unfortunately for the Finn-cum-Australian, those problems that he had with Mercedes that day came with him. Having that wheel nut failure happen to you once is bad enough. It's just a bit of a damp squib to a weekend that might not have yielded that much in terms of success or even a point or two. Whereas now, this has happened at every single race this time. There has been at least one pit stop gaffe that team has had to go through, and also at a couple of them, it's compromised the opportunity to even have a snifter of a chance of scoring a point. If Sauber hadn't had these pit stop issues, and they might have gone on to get a couple of 10th places, they would have 2 points right now, and be in contention for 7th place in the Constructors alongside Haas, because they would have denied Haas a couple of points. They'd be square and competitive. And when you consider that one of their rival teams bagging 6 points in one go, Yuki Tsunoda's 7th place in Melbourne, that's a huge deal. For them, it's practically winning the World Championship. It puts them in the pound seat for the best non-top 5 team. Zhou Guanyu was on course for contesting Hulkenberg perhaps a 10th place in Jeddah, and even if he hadn't been able to convert it into said point, the fact that that car could challenge for one would have been a little win for them, like we saw in Bahrain with Zhou as well, when he actually did bring it home. Being in the hunt for a point is something for that team currently. But all of that is completely undone when you can't get your wheel undone. And then you just do this kind of cross thing and it goes and you can't get the wheel off. It's one of the most frustrating things because in a pit stop these days, not much happens. A pit stop really shouldn't be called a pit stop. It's just a tire change. But now both Bottas and Zhou have to go into a race where they then think, oh god, we have to go for a pit stop, praying for a miracle that they can actually get out of the pits long before they need to consider a changing career and maybe take up a little bit of poetry on the side before they can actually go for the pit exit. It kind of makes me miss refueling in a way. And that 2009 thing where they published the weights of the cars for the race grids, that means people knew how much fuel a car had and what little they had, it was really cool. With Bottas in his effective home race, he was on course for a very good shout for 10th place, potentially denying one of the Haas machines. This was a rare crumb of comfort for the Finn, who basically had to find solace in doing really daft advertising campaigns, which did go down very well on the internet and were actually hilarious, and goes to show that Finn has a very interesting sense of humour, as well as showing his love for Aurora Borealis and steamed hams. If you think he doesn't get that reference, oh he does. This guy has a Simpsons mural in his house. But with the pit stop issues and that faulty equipment being the watchword, it makes the drivers second guess themselves and think that there's completely no point in competing, and that if you get to a point where you have a pit stop, which is effectively 4 seconds in length, which is the equivalent of 2 McLaren Qatar pit stops, a record that team will not shut up about, by the way, that's considered by the commentators a good pit stop. I thought Mercedes' pit stop record was lousy. The one of Sauber's right now is positively embarrassing. Sure, the team has actually spoken out and apologised to the drivers for the pit stop issues, and they are trying their best to fix it as quickly as possible. But the issue that Sauber has explained is that this equipment is something that is provided by a third party and not something made in-house, and therefore there's a little bit of a feedback loop which is taking longer than they would like to ideally resolve. It's kind of like that situation with the brakes that Verstappen's car completely disintegrated and exploded. They were provided by Brembo. Red Bull pointed out the brake failure and that Brembo supplied the brakes, and they went, whoa, that's a Red Bull problem, not us. They're just passing the buck. So Brembo's at fault, Red Bull's at fault. Who's at fault? I don't know. And then on top of that, the team gets fined €5,000 for the fact that one of the wheel nuts escaped and almost took out a guy's shin. And trust me, you don't want something whacking your shin. It's really, really painful. But it's okay though. That casino money that's keeping that team afloat, €5,000 in the era of Drake F1 team, it's but a mere silent toot from Valtteri's bot or ass, depending on your lexicon. Okay, I'll stop with the toilet humour. I wouldn't want to leave your impression of me on a bum note. Will they fix the issue though? Well, they kinda have to. But according to the race, this might not be the case until maybe the likes of Imola when we get to the European races. That's not until May. Bottas and Zhou will be crossing their fingers and toes and other bits and extremities of their body that they're not stuck in the pits for more than 30 seconds. Now, I bet you're thinking that, why didn't they just use last year's equipment? Because that worked fine. We didn't hear that having any issue. Well, that is a fair point, but I will stress that this car, this year, is a brand new concept. They made a big song and dance about it because the 2023 Alfa Romeo car and the 2024 Sauber car are quite different, and therefore, different wheel nuts, different equipment. It'd be very difficult to retrofit the old stuff onto the new stuff without some kind of issues of their own. They also claim that this problem did not come up in testing or in practice at Hinwil or even during the winter testing. It just was something that suddenly appeared and they simply can't get their head around. But for the next couple of races, Zhou and Bottas are going to be spending most of their race out there second guessing whether or not the pit stop is going to go by without a hitch. And that little distraction could make a big difference when it comes to their on-track performance, because already that car isn't setting the world alight, but sometimes it does have its moments, and the drivers find themselves in a position where they might be able to challenge for a point. And then they go into the pits and then it's completely undone. Therefore, morale is made even lower. On this occasion, it's the team letting the drivers down instead of the drivers letting the team down, which seems to be the watchword for the most part. Or is it, though? Now, take this next rumour with a bit of salmiak, which, by the way, I really like. But there are rumblings about the future of the Sauber lineup, with Andreas Seidl, soon to become the CEO of Audi F1 team, looking for alternatives when it comes to their drivers. Looking for alternative drivers currently in 2024 is understandable. There are so many vacancies and so many drivers which will become free agents for the 2025 season. So therefore, you will want to consider your options instead of just simply sticking blindly to the drivers you've already got, unless your names are Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, of course. But in regards to Sauber, it's a little bit early to start looking elsewhere, considering that for the first few races, they've not been able to show their full potential. Or if they have been able to show some potential, it's been completely and utterly squandered in the pits, therefore they're left down right at the bottom, and many people going, why on earth are they down there? Considering they were up there at one point. And then many people thinking, oh, it's just Alfa Romeo or those drivers just doing all of that again. When you're in the middle of an operational kerfuffle and a questionable title sponsor sort of making the team look a complete and utter joke, almost more of a joke than Alpine is right now, because at least their pit stops aren't slow, this is sort of a thing you really don't want rumors to be spreading about, that you're thinking about dropping the drivers in the here and now. And again, it's a title sponsor that can't fully market itself in certain territories. That's just silly. Once again, the name Nico Hulkenberg keeps coming back into the picture, since Sauber have a very good history with a German driver, despite him only being there for one season, and yet scoring so many points for them. As I said before many times, Sauber were considering Hulkenberg for 2024, but Haas took up the option on their 1+1 deal with Nico, and therefore Sauber couldn't get him for 2024. Now, just because that was the case, that doesn't mean they're suddenly just going to go, okay, Nico's off the market then, oh well, we'll completely ignore him for 2025. Of course they're going to be looking at him for 2025, because I'm pretty sure that Nico will want to be looked at. The fact that he's still hot property at his age is something that he's not going to ignore. He's had a second chance in Formula 1, and so far the work he's done at Haas has made him a really tantalizing prospect, not to mention all of the stuff that he did as a super sub. That Racing Point showcase at Silverstone was remarkable, qualifying in P3. Yes, it was the pink Mercedes, but still, Nico, P3, pole he got in 2010, he's still really good in qualifying. With Seidl in charge, it's understandable that they would want a German driver driving for a German automaker. Supposedly, from the likes of Motorsport Magazine's Christian Meneth, Seidl himself might have been actively involved in the talks with Hulkenberg. And when you get the boss himself potentially marshalling the acquisition of a driver so directly, that's when you know the driver is valued and wanted. And as we saw with Piastri being acquired by McLaren, sometimes being wanted and cherished is enough to get you to move from one team to the other. When it comes to the midfield, Nico is still a great catch. As for Bottas and Zhou, it's been a little bit confusing. I personally thought them being kept for 2024 was a little bit of a confusing situation. Sure, Bottas was contracted for 2024, but then with Zhou, it was a little bit up in the air. There were talks briefly that Porsche, the current F2 champion, was going to get the seat, and he almost did. But then last minute talks came about, Zhou was kept on for another year, and therefore there were talks about, oh, it was just because of the money. And then there was talks about the engineers not really being happy with that decision, and that Zhou had better not make any mistakes, or else he will be left on his hook. But then again, Sauber are the ones, the engineers, making the mistakes. So, oops. And the point that Meneth makes out for Motorsport magazine is that Bottas and Zhou were hired by Fred Vasseur. Now he's the Ferrari boss, he's long gone. Seidel might not share the same enthusiasm for those two drivers, so maybe when their contracts are up, they won't want to seek a further extension, so just honor the agreement that they have and then just be done with it. Look for other drivers. If you really get down dirty with those rumours, they might want to have gotten rid of Bottas a year early, Seidel wanting rid of him, supposedly. And that maybe Nico could have been his replacement. Then Valtteri would have definitely been out on his arse, no longer having a seat in Formula 1. What makes me think that there's a little bit of discord with Valtteri and his relationship with Sauber going forward from 2024 is that the Finn's starting to get a little bit more critical than he had been in the past. For the longest time, ever since he joined the team, he was very diplomatic, reserved, quiet when it came to criticism of the team. Obviously, now that Audi's starting to big up its investment and involvement in the team, he wants to put on a good impression that he's a team player. He's not going to be kicking off and sounding off about operational issues that the team have, even though Audi are somewhat inconspicuous when it comes to their involvement, despite owning 50% of the team currently. Yes, they're going to be extending that, but right now you think Bottas is just being a goody two-shoes. But now, that goody two-shoes mentality is starting to diminish, because we are now starting to see some very, very vocal criticism from him, claiming that he could have scored points in Melbourne, but the pit stops let him down, and that if they can't fix that, it doesn't matter how the car is or how well you drive. What Bottas is doing right now is shouting from the rooftops to any team that will listen that, hey, I'm not slow, it's the team letting me down. I could have scored a 10th place in probably the 9th fastest car. That is something to take note of. That is something that you should consider if you are looking to hire my services for next year. I get the feeling that talks behind the scenes with his management and Andreas Seidel and the Audi board aren't going all that great. So, damage limitation. Granted, he wasn't all that happy at Mercedes, and coming over to Alfa Romeo and Sauber was a new lease of life for him. We could see Valtteri's sense of humour really flourish, and that he was genuinely relieved not to be in the really stilted and somewhat serious mood being Lewis Hamilton's teammate. But at the same time, after that first half of 2022, the results really weren't forthcoming. That first race for Alfa in Bahrain, where Bottas was competitive, he got it into Q3 and scored major points, that's all but a distant memory at this point. But he isn't wrong though. He's not whinging. It's quite valid to talk about pit stops and how they can scupper a race. Yes, this was only for a singular point, but again, for Sauber, a point is a big deal, and they potentially could have lost at least 2 of them. In some cases, pit stops could determine whether or not a person could win a world championship. And this doesn't just affect the driver, it affects everybody. It affects the mood of the mechanics, especially the person whose wheel nut failed, so it feels like that they're personally responsible for the driver's failure. Then, of course, there's the race strategists. They now have to come up with a brand new plan since the plan has been completely and utterly tarnished by one little anomaly. Then, of course, there's the management and the press department who have to explain to the world what's been going on and that this problem has still not been fixed. So it's a headache for everybody. In that sense, how can a team score points? Sure, Williams and Haas have their own administrative errors, but at least they can service their cars adequately. All of the bottom teams have something fundamental that they need to get over before they can really set their eyes straight on the prize of 6th place, because getting P5 this year, I don't think that's going to happen. Racing Bulls has their driver lineup and synergy with their new parts and workflow to get themselves round. Williams has a similar case study, but even more so, especially when it comes to their spare parts allocation. Haas is recovering from the loss of Steiner and reinventing themselves into an engineer-led outfit, and Alpine is just, well, everything needs to be fixed. As for Sauber, it's, well, not quite certain. In fact, you could say it's almost just like another Alpine. Everything has an issue. The car isn't all that great, the drivers aren't exactly inspired, and they're somewhat down in the dumps. You feel like Sauber are just in a holding pattern. And this is a real shame considering how I used to view Sauber back in the day. This is not the Sauber that I remember. When I heard that Sauber was going to be coming back for a couple of seasons, I thought, oh, cool, a swan song. For this team that I remember very fondly. In fact, I was a fan of them back in the day, in the late 90s and early 2000s. They looked like the definition of a solid midfield team. Despite the fact that they somewhat weren't all that great in terms of publicity, they had a stable foothold. They had really good sponsors with Red Bull and Petronas. They had a really good working relationship with Ferrari and their engines. Yes, of course they were a year old, as was designed by Ross Brawn, because they didn't want to give them the big fancy new engines, but still, a 1-year-old Ferrari motor? Surely that's got to be really good when you're fighting for the midfield. And also, they were more likely to get the occasional podium or solid points finish. I remember quite regularly a Sauber just winding up in P3. I believe Johnny Herbert got a podium with them at one point. And then Nick Heidfeld would get podiums with them. 2001 was a really good year. That was their best year when they were not being operated by another outfit, because they had Heidfeld and Kimi Räikkönen on the books. And remember, those first few races that Kimi Räikkönen was on board with Sauber, he was on probation. The FIA thought that he wasn't a good enough driver, that he might have been dangerous. Yeah, he was dangerous when it came to the bar, but when it came to driving a car, no. He was really good. Go and look at the Belgian Grand Prix 2002, what Kimi did. That's ballsy. My impression of Sauber was that they were plucky, resourceful, one of the perennial midfielders that rarely found itself in financial turmoil. They just mucked in, and they were somehow able to survive after BMW completely abandoned them. The fact they were able to get a car back on the grid and get some different drivers, they got Kobayashi in, they got Checo in, they had a really good time of it. Then they had Hulkenberg, and then suddenly they disappeared again. And then that was it. And that was just a bit of a wet fart before Alfa Romeo came back in and saved their bacon. Fast forward to now and I just don't see that anymore. Despite the car being mostly black again, like its first iteration, as the pioneering outfit showcasing Mercedes engine power for the first time in the modern F1 age, this iteration of Sauber is just treading water until the German automaker decides that, okay, I want to be in Formula 1 now, and therefore they can take the reins and really get serious. This is just a bit of a shadow of the Sauber self of the 90s. This is not the same team. Thankfully, all of those rumors that we heard about a month or so ago, about Audi having talks with Oliver Hoffmann and potentially firing him, that turned out not to be true. In fact, they were doubling up and upping the ante by getting Hoffmann directly involved with the F1 project. They're now on course to take full control of Sauber, and thusly, most likely, the name of Sauber will disappear. This isn't a Doralton Capital Williams situation where the investors respect their heritage and see value in it. Sauber, though, no. It's a niche brand. It's a name that only motoring enthusiasts know about and people who work in the industry. Say the name Sauber to somebody who's not really all that familiar in Formula 1 and they'll give you a blank look. It's not like Williams where they have documentaries about them, there's some sort of historical context. There's something about the Williams brand that does transcend Formula 1. Whereas with Sauber, you really have to know your stuff before you even get a clue about what they're about. Simply put, Sauber is not nearly as recognizable as Audi, and call me a cynic here, but I kind of think that this is almost deliberate, that these next 2 years of Sauber are going to be seen as a bit of a farce, that there are errors, that they're slow, they're going to be just working in the background to fix things, and that when Audi do come in, there might be a market improvement, that instead of just being the 8th, 9th, or 10th fastest car, they might suddenly just leap up in 2026 as maybe being right up in the midfield, maybe even troubling the likes of Aston Martin, and therefore there'll be a tour de force. Audi's direct involvement will be seen as a huge celebration. Nico Hulkenberg gets his first podium in 2026, and therefore everybody's happy. Everybody loves Audi, and then Sauber's completely forgotten because this was the way for Audi to get in, and this way their slow transition will be proved right. They'll have been seen to have been patient, logical, and not rushing things too fast, because as we saw with Lola and MasterCard, rushing things in does lead to major troubles. Therefore, Audi will have been vindicated in going softly for about 4 years. I am aware that Sauber said that they weren't aware of these faults with the pit stops, and that it's just one little thing, but if this keeps going, and that we see in Suzuka, and then in Shanghai, and then in Miami, all of these faults with the pit stops coming in again, and Sauber having no chance to score points, this is going to make it even harder for them to score more points in the year going forward, because as we've seen in 2022 and 23, Alfa Romeo scoring points becomes less and less likely as the season progresses. If they can't score them now, they probably won't score them later. and then Bottas and Zhou will have barely anything to show for it, and then Sauber will have the perfect excuse to just completely drop them, say to Zhou, thanks for the money, but yeah, we're good. We managed to parade you around Shanghai one time, we've had our fill. And then they can start to showcase to other people that Audi are now fully in control of the Sauber organization, that hey, we mean business. We are a full-on works manufacturer team, and we want your services. We want you, Nico. Come over here because you're German, and you are a fan favorite, and you're somewhat good in qualifying. And then, of course, there are other drivers to consider to help lead the team alongside Hulkenberg. Personally, I think Hulkenberg and Perez will be a good lineup because they work really well together at Force India, but honestly, the rumours keep pointing to Carlos Sainz being the leader of this new Audi operation since his father does have a connection to them. But he also has a connection, Carlos Sainz Sr., to Red Bull, because there are a lot more rumours going about that Carlos Sainz might find himself returning to the Red Bull fold after all. He might be the latest apple in Christian Horner's eye since Daniel Ricciardo seems to have gone rotten, which is something I go into more detail about in this video here. You can go and watch right now. Let chaos ensue.